Okay. So I think what I want to do, whenever I'm teaching U.S. history, whenever I'm talking about this nation, is to sort of equip us with stories that have to do with the privileges and the responsibilities of citizenship. I think one of the mistakes so often we make when we talk about history, and I think, I'll be honest, I had my share of history teachers that you came in, you read the chapter, you answered the questions at the end of each section, you memorized facts and you memorized dates, but you didn't feel the fog on your face, and you didn't feel the dust as the soldiers were marching across the mountains or whatever, and it didn't become a real story. And I want us to really spend some time in this series, on the days that you're able to join me, on the days that maybe you're listening to a recording, talking about the fact that history really is a story. And it's a story that is so much evidenced by how we see things. That's why you can't read just one book on history. That's why there have been, there are, the most published book in the history of the world is the Bible. But close to that, in second place, are biographies of Abraham Lincoln and biographies that have to do with other great, well-known figures. And that's because there's so many interpretations of history. So I want us to spend time talking about how history is this story that's filled with some of our most enlightened moments in history's existence. Think about human existence. Think about someone like a Thomas Jefferson drafting the words in the Declaration of Independence when he talks about when the course of human events, just those choices of words. So some of the most enlightened moments in our human history are associated with the history of the United States. And yet at the same time, I think we are all very honest in talking about the fact that we sometimes fall short of what the dream was. And, I would say that that's because we're human beings, and we have those human characteristics of frailties and flaws and things of that nature. So, I really think it's important that we know, and in knowing, then we get meaning. And when we get meaning, then things become very, very personal. History really is important for each of us. And I often tell people history begins with the idea of our own personal history and how that fits into a larger history. So I can't see all of you, but I would love to ask you, if we were in a classroom and I had my shoes off and we were walking around and I was talking to you, I would ask, how many of you have, as you have gotten maybe over the age of 25, have more of an interest in your own personal family history? And I have a feeling that a lot of you would raise your hands, because I think we all kind of look at ourselves sometimes and we wonder who we are, where we came from, what is that genetic mix? Why do I do certain things that I do that people will say, aha, I see the Ragland in you, and the truth of the matter is I never knew my Ragland great grandparents, but I'm often credited with being very much like my great grandmother. And I think we want to know the answers to those questions. We want to know our individual story. And yet at the same time, we know that all of our individual stories are very different. My late husband was number 5 of 7 brothers. And one of my favorite things was when they would get together and start talking about their own personal family history, even events that had happened within their life when they were all 7 living in the same house. The different perspectives were intriguing. And there were times that, they would start out in a very humorous manner, and then they would become somewhat agitated because, no, that's not how it was. This is how it was. And that's how the story of history is. So, what I want us to do in this class is examine some different viewpoints of why history is important, why those stories are important, and how the stories shape who we are. I have read most of my life Will Durant, who is so, I'm looking at the messages to see, I don't even know if I still have an audience. Yeah, I see some numbers there, so I'm assuming you're there. Will Durant is quite famous for having written a multi-volume set called The Story of Civilization, and he tried to record history, taking up where he said the ancient Greeks and Petrarch and others had realized that history was important. And his idea was that history is nothing more than the study of mankind's journey through time, but that unfortunately history books tend to record the stories of a few significant people during each age, and everybody else is just sort of out there hanging on the edges. And I will tell you, I love my genealogy friends who say, I've done my ancestry and I trace myself from some incredibly prominent person. I'm still looking for my incredibly prominent person. I tell everyone I'm from a family that has pretty consistently been teachers, preachers, and farmers, heavy on the farmers. But I do think all of that is important when we look at history. George Eliot, the author, had a quote, and it's one that I have actually hanging up to remind me sometimes of what I do, where he said that history often ignores, and his statement was, those who lived faithfully a hidden life and now rest in unvisited tombs. I find that to be incredibly profound, because we are as a race of people, as Americans, sort of a uniquely blended race, a nation of people. We are an awful lot of those stories of people that no one remembers their names, and perhaps no one visits their tombs, their graves any longer. So we're going to start out on a journey today. I like to think of this nation as the land of hope and the land of opportunity. And it is, in being the land of hope and the land of opportunity, that also means that our story is often a story of dashed hopes, difficult journeys, unfulfilled dreams. But I think sometimes what makes this nation so unique and makes our history so unique is that we have that hope. We have that ability to dream. And we have a certain level, our way of life says that we have a certain amount of responsibility for making our own dreams come true. So let's begin at the beginning of our story, which, if you were sitting in a history class, I would tell you just happens to be the middle of an earlier history story. So in reality,
I'm fine.
There's never truly a beginning for any story of history, unless we were all present at the creation.
No.
The truth of the matter is, the story of mankind is the story of a constantly moving history. It's sort of like a river always flowing toward the horizon, and then you realize as you get close to the horizon that there's a world beyond where your original view was. Much like Durant likes to talk about civilization. So I can't see all of you. We'll have that figured out by next time, I hope, so that I'll be able to look at you and see you better. But I want to ask you a question, and then I want you to think about it for just a moment. What's your earliest memory? What's your earliest recollection that involves family or involves a major event? It's funny, in all my years of teaching, the answer to that question when I would ask students has changed significantly. And for most people, there aren't memories prior to 5 or 6 years that are very concrete, unless something traumatic happened. When I ask, and Mary Ann just said grandfather's death at 3, my mother always swore she remembered the death of her grandfather when she was only, a little over 2, because it was so traumatic. But for most of us, it's maybe starting school. It may be an event that occurs maybe in a group with other children. It may be something that was a unique experience. I love that you all are putting things up in the chat box, because that's kind of how we begin with our history. When I walk into a class of young students now, and I have to remember, I was in a class of seniors just last week, and it's really an aging moment for me when I realized that the high school seniors that I had in class last year were born 2 years after 9/11, and they're the only presidents that anyone in the class remembered actually watching on television during the actual time they were serving was President Obama and President Trump, and of course Joe Biden, because they were really not old enough when George W. left office to have a conscious memory of him. And then, one of them said, Mrs. Mines, who's the first president that you remember seeing on television? And I sort of felt like I had mold and mildew on my body when I said, Eisenhower. Eisenhower, that's, and I don't think of myself as being that old, but I remember the end of Eisenhower's presidency. And I think that's how we begin to formulate the way that we look at history. Your memories become your personal history, and you may or may not have the same view of those memories. When I talk to groups of people my age, I'll say, what's the first really huge event that you remember in our nation's history? Sometimes people will say Sputnik. Sometimes people will say the building of the Berlin Wall. Probably everyone in every audience who is my age remembers JFK, the assassination. They're just sorts of things that have that sort of significance on who we are in our collective history. The truth of the matter is our personal history is based on stories and events that are transmitted to us by our own experiences, but also stories our families tell us. And that's why every time I visit a classroom, whether it is, first graders, God love first grade teachers, they deserve combat pay. Whether I'm visiting a first grade class or I'm visiting a high school class, or I'm visiting a group as I did last Friday at a Kiwanis meeting, is I always say to them, sit down with the elders, sit down with your elders and ask them about their memories, because then that becomes a part of your own history. Well, the history of the nation is a similar sort of experience, because it's a collection of stories shared by those who experienced events. If I look at diaries and journals from the Battle of Chickamauga, since we are just now having passed the anniversary of that battle for those of us that are in Chattanooga, and we're coming up on the battles of Chattanooga, if you read different journals, everyone's perspective on that battle, there's a common agreement of the carnage and the smoke and the death and destruction and all that, but each one's memories are sort of different. Well, our nation's history is much the same way. History books are written by authors, their perceptions are based on what was most striking to them. So any book that you read, any author you choose to follow, whether you are addicted to John Meacham and you've read his biographies of George H.W. and Winston and FDR or Andrew Jackson or whomever, or if you're addicted to James McPherson because you're into the Civil War, or you love reading Joseph Eliot because he's into the Founding Fathers, all these different authors, what you'll find is they have particular interest also, and they tend to write in those fields of interest. So, they do their research, they write, they edit, they rewrite, and then their story emerges. And our history is somewhere in a blending of all of those. So in the 20 minutes or so that we have left, I want to kind of bring you up to how we end up here in what I do believe is this great land of opportunity. Sometimes today we apologize for the uniqueness of the American experience because we are less than perfect people. We are flawed individuals, and our nation has flaws in its history. But I feel so strongly when you look at the concepts of a Republican form of government, you look at the right to vote and historically how that right has been extended, you look at active, engaged citizenship, that our history is really something unique. So let's go back maybe thousands of years back to the midst of the early times. And one of the things that we know about this continent is there probably were no native peoples, but we do know that probably what we deem to be native peoples were here long before the Vikings, long before Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. How many of you remember memorizing that little ditty when you were yet just a wee little tyke? And I would wager that the idea that leads to the founding of this nation, and I'm going to kind of build a case for you, and then you can agree or disagree with me, is that as humans, we are always intrigued by the idea of something beyond the horizon. a better world, a new beginning, a better chance. So we're going to begin there. I look at the founding of the United States, that beginning of a new colonial world, what will be the Americas, as not a branch that comes off of the tree in Europe, but instead I think of us as an offshoot of an old tree. The truth of the matter is there wasn't a grafting off of that tree and then a replanting of the same, but we become something very, very different. Now, obviously we retain some of the parts that have been established in Europe. English laws, English customs in many ways, but that will be blended with some French customs, some of the Spanish customs, some of the native customs that we will pick up, whether it has to do with agriculture or whether it has to do with the way that we live our lives on our farms as we begin to go westward or whatever. But the truth of the matter is that this was replanting a new home, a new land, and it was going to flourish in a way that I don't think could have ever happened in the old world. There were too many barriers to that sort of a profound change. So my thesis for today is that the settlement of America had its origins in the unsettlement of Europe. And those of you who loved Western civilization, who just wallowed in early Middle Ages and high Middle Ages and Renaissance and everything, know exactly what I'm talking about, because you will remember. And if you didn't take Western Civ, this is the 15-minute snippet that will catch you up to it. And then you need to, there's so many wonderful books out there to go read. I'm not an independent bookseller, but I do encourage you constantly to be reading. Go to the library, buy books. There's so much knowledge, and we have such a limited amount of time. But I would tell you that by 1492, Europe did not look like the Europe that had been there only 3 centuries earlier. So we're going to do a real quick timeline, because if we were in a classroom, I would be writing on the board and I'd be doing a timeline for you, just because it's sort of a roadmap. And I'm one of those concrete sequential people who is concrete sequential, and then I go abstract random and go wild on you and start bringing in ideas, and which is why we always run over time. But if you'll remember the early Middle Ages, the time that we consider to be from the fall of the Roman Empire until about the 1200s, after the fall of the Roman Empire, which tended to be the organization that held Europe together by force, by faith, all those sorts of things. The early Middle Ages is that period of time that when I was a little girl, we referred to as the Dark Ages. There was that analogy that the lights had gone out in Europe and everybody is living in the dark, and people are in cloistered monasteries, the rise of feudalism because you needed to be attached to a manor house, because then the lord of the manor house and the knights of the manor house would take care of the peasants. I would have been a peasant. I'm perfectly aware of where I would have been. I would have been out there milking a cow or making cheese or doing something. But that there was an alliance that develops by 800 with Charlemagne, where you have the Pope of the Church, the Western branch of what was the Holy Roman Catholic Church, which, for those of us who are historians, we always laugh and say it was neither holy nor truly Roman. It may have been Catholic, small c, meaning universal, but it was the church, that alliance between the church and political leaders, the knights who became lords, who became kings in certain dynasties, that would maintain power. So when the Pope crowns Charlemagne as the ruler of all of Christendom, that was sort of God's anointing on the power that would be bestowed upon those leaders that will become the royal families. Then we get to the High Middle Ages, and things begin to shake a little. There's a lot of new energy. There's disruption in governments. There are problems within the church. And that's not a criticism of faith, but it's a criticism of people who gain power. And it doesn't matter whether it's in the church or it's in politics or it's in business or whatever, the old adage of the fact that power can be a very corrupting influence. So that occurs even within the church. And with a lessening of the power of the church, there's more of an ability to think in different ways, because there were just certain things you weren't supposed to think about. you weren't supposed to read on your own without someone reading to you, because, you know, there's nothing like getting dangerous ideas because you're reading. That's the best reason in the world I know for reading, is so that you have ideas and you think. So anyway, that sort of innovative thinking leads to a Renaissance. Well, the Renaissance, you know, we all remember the Renaissance as being a rebirth. And I always like to think rebirth maybe in that intriguing intellectual curiosity, but it's not a rebirth in the sense of a reinstatement of the old ways. It's suddenly like, let's think about what could we possibly do. And don't you love that when you sit around and you're doing true brainstorming where you say, okay, here's the problem, how can we fix it? And nobody go, oh, when somebody says something, nobody say, no, that won't work or whatever. Let's just truly brainstorm and see what comes out. So the Renaissance is that sort of period. It's a period of great historical transformation. We could do an entire class on the Renaissance. That would be so much fun, doing Renaissance art. That would tie in with why I'm here in Vegas doing an art dealer's workshop. But that Renaissance period is based on a multitude of causes. But what I will tell you is that by 1492, the foundations were changing and they were shaking, and people were beginning to sort of accept the fact that there's change. So now let's go back to your earliest classes. Think about what creates that change, because that's what's going to lead us to the idea of coming eventually to a new world. So think back to when you sat in class and you remember that our movement to the West actually was based on movement to the East. Much of that was caused by the Crusades. Everybody remember the Crusades? Remember the Crusades? You know, I at least remember the one that is my favorite, when it is Philip Augusta of France, and it is Frederick Barbarossa, the Red-Beard German, and it is, of course, you know, Richard the Lion-Hearted from England, Be Still My Heart. I'm sorry, when I say Richard the Lion-Hearted's name, I hear Sean Connery's voice in my ears because he played him so often, you know, and they go off on the crusade. And there is this idea that they are going to consolidate through this series of crusades that are endorsed by the church. They will consolidate all of the power and the faith, and, you know, everybody will be standing up, and instead of singing Kumbaya, we'll all be singing, you know, Blessed Be the Tie, that sort of thing. You know, we're going to really unite the entire world in the Christian faith. We're going to take control of the promised land, you know, the Holy Land, and we will all be one people. I'd like to point out that didn't work out exactly the way that those founding European leaders thought that it would. You know, we might look at the conflicts that go on in the Middle East today and go on in areas where we today have troops who are much in need of our prayers, where there's still chaos and there's still conflict between faith and power and all sorts of other things. But anyway, while the Crusades were supposed to consolidate the power of the church, what it really did was it sort of shook the foundations of the church, because suddenly you have these people exposed to the rich cultures of the Middle East and beyond. It leads to the desire to create overland trails to the region, and then the desire, you know, trails are just too dangerous. There are thieves, and, you know, it's hard to carry stuff, and, you know, we don't have enough beast of burden. So let's figure out water access to the east. That would be the Middle East and the Far East, because at the simultaneously, as we are beginning to look at all these wonderfully luxurious things that could come from the Near East and the Far East, it also is going to change society. It's going to change the mere footprint of what European life was like. And we're going to move from a medieval synergy of lord and vassal to a merchant-based society. So all of a sudden, you have people who become wealthy. Europeans of wealth needed, they would have told you they wanted and they needed brocades and silks and perfumes and teas and stones and exotic woods and unusual spices, so that by the 15th century, by the time that Columbus comes along toward the end of that century, you've got the benefits of bringing in the best aspects of the Asian culture. Asian cultures is absolutely enticing. Now, for that to occur, what's happening in Europe that will allow us to create this new world where we are all the products of that period of immigration? there's exploration, there's mapping, there's that idea of looking beyond the horizon. And to look beyond the horizon, literally and figuratively, you have astronomical navigation. You know, how do we sell off? How many of you remember, if you're my age, my kids used to love an animated movie called An American Tail. Anyone remember An American Tail? Feifel, the little mouse who's leaving. And I used to open my classes when I would talk about exploration with my students. I would turn the lights off, have them put their heads down, close their eyes, and I would play. There's a song in it where Feifel is, you know, he's in a new place and he's saying, somewhere out there, somebody is missing me tonight. And it basically is, he doesn't know where his mother is. He doesn't know where his father is. He doesn't know if he'll ever see them again. And he's taking comfort from the fact that he believes they're all looking at the same star. And I would say to my students, adult students, college level or high school level students, imagine that you're getting ready to leave for the new world and you're hugging mom or dad, brothers or sisters, whomever, goodbye, and you don't know that you will ever see them again or even ever hear from them again. What would you want to say as your last farewell? You know, I've had 23-year-old men sob. You know, I don't know if I could have gone. I don't know if I could have left. I don't know. Oh my goodness. Because, you know, we would talk about the fact there wasn't a mail system. You could sometimes, if you were wealthy enough, send a letter by ship, but there was no guarantee. The truth of the matter is, most of the families that have new families who go out exploring, unless they came back at some point, they were truly explorers and they were not looking at creating a new place. They never heard from them again. They never knew what happened to that child. That mom never knew what happened to the child that she'd carried in her body for 9 months and had watched take the first breath. You know, that's the kind of stuff that gets you all weepy and gets you carrying on and everything. And yet it's that sort of wanting something better for your child that would allow people to let their kids go. It was that sort of innovation. So you've got, you know, new magnetic compasses, you've got the astrolabe, you've got the cross staff. You know, my sailing friends all understand all of that. I mean, I can hold my astrolabe up and pretend I know what I'm doing, but I don't. I'm not a sailor. But you have new kinds of ships, all of that. You've got trade expanding the social and the political map. You have wealth and power changing hands. You've got a new merchant class of traders who are becoming wealthy because they're taking risk and then they're reaping the rewards of having taken those chances. And that, you know, is going to give way to the whole idea of a new form of economy. Instead of it being mercantilism, where there's a limited amount of wealth in the world, and the way you become wealthy is you swap wealth. You know, you have more than I have, therefore I take your wealth away from you. You know, I might do it through war, I might do it through whatever, but I basically clobber you over the head. I take your wealth and I am now wealthier. Well, the idea of that will begin to emerge during the Renaissance is there's wealth to be created. There are resources to be used that we didn't understand the potential of in the past. So there's going to be, you know, this idea of traders need to be near ports. You've got the rise of new cities. Well, when you have cities, then you've got trading and buying and selling, and you need to have people that help you do those sorts of things. So suddenly you need bankers. Remember that during medieval time, and even through the High Renaissance, if you were Christian, you couldn't be a banker, because banking is based on the premise that you make money by moving other people's money around, but you're not earning your money by the sweat of your own brow. So that was considered to be a major sin, which is why the majority of the early bankers, early Middle Ages, as we're coming out of this and in through the High Renaissance, tended to be Jewish bankers. It was not a predisposition to banking. It was that no one else could do it, and they could, because it was not deemed to be a crime, a sin within their beliefs. So you've got a need for bankers, you have a need for lawyers, you have a need for people to insure ships. You know, insurance comes about in the 15th century, insuring cargoes, all those sorts of things. You even need teachers, because now you actually need to know things like math. You need to know how to read and write, not just to be able to read your Bible, but because now you're entering into contracts and you're taking on shipments and everything. So new economy is created, new political structures. By the time we hit 1492, there are four major national states in Europe. Some state is the system of government. Nation is a people who share a common culture and heritage. So, we interchange them in this country. We'll say, well, the United States, that's our nation. Well, it is sort of, because we're a blending of people, but the United States is actually our system of government. It is our state, and then we are the people of the nation. But anyway, the four major states that have come about by 1492 are France, England, Spain, and Portugal. And they have emerged. They are powerful, and there is competition in the air. I mean, those of us who love European history always talk about France and England are always best friends, except when they're not. And it's usually when they are rivals, and the rivalries are normally precipitated by economic sorts of issues. Sometimes faith plays into that, but it still ties back to economics. Spain and Portugal, we don't think of as much today, but they were the first major power. So let's talk real quickly. How much time do we have? Escads, not much. Okay. So Portugal, you've got Prince Henry the Navigator. That name probably rings a bell that you remember from your European history. Probably names as we begin to look at exploring the world. Okay, we sort of know what's here in Europe. What's out there, and how do we get to Asia? How do we get to the Far East? What other exotic things are there out there that we could use in our lives that would make our lives more beautiful? We've gone from just surviving to let's add beauty to our lives. So you've got names like Bartholomew Diaz, Vasco da Gama, names that you probably remember from early history, but I would never ask you what it is they actually did. As far as exploration, I'll give you a hint. Da Gama and Diaz are the first to circumnavigate the southern tip of Africa, which is crucial to getting to Asia. It is no mistake that Columbus, who is Italian by birth, most people think he's Spanish, but he's actually Italian. He's a Genoan. He is in Lisbon, Portugal by the time he is 26, because he's going to learn about sailing from the Portuguese masters. Spain is our second major power, and that's where we're going to concentrate today, because that's how we get to the story of our beginning. So as Columbus is training with the Portuguese, the truth of the matter is that Spain will very quickly eclipse the Portuguese. Portugal is a small nation, and while they become wealthy, they do not become wealthy in the way that Spain will. So let's talk about Spain for just a second. There's this, with Columbus, the fascinating story of Columbus sailing toward India, but ending up in what he will deem to be the Indies. We will today call them the West Indies, as opposed to the East Indies, which is where he really wanted to be going. So he lands in a new world, which really ought to be called a undiscovered world, because it's not like it was really new. It was pretty much there as long as the old world had been there. His first voyage, he lands on an island that he calls San Salvador, Holy Savior, because part of his dual mission to satisfy Ferdinand and Isabella is not only economic wealth that can be gained from this, and rest assured the Spanish were looking for wealth, but there was also this expansion of the Christian faith, the true Christian faith, because even by 1492, there are beginning to be rumblings against the church. It is Columbus who deems the people that he encounters to be Indians, and that name still is used today. He will, between 1492 and 1503, make 4 trips to the New World. What I find fascinating is if you read portions of his journals, if you read things written by the people who've really studied him in depth, is that interestingly, he makes one of the most important discoveries in human history, and yet he was totally 100% blind to its possibilities. He never, ever saw or acknowledged the Americas to be the new thing that they were, and he had no ability to envision what it would become. I think my takeaway in today's lesson, because we're about out of time, is it was what Portugal and Spain were doing with exploration was critical to the founding of this nation. And we will, pick up next week looking at those first settlements, and we'll do that very quickly. No one wants to wallow around in colonial times too long. But I think the major takeaway today is, I'm thinking of how to say this, but it's what we find is not always what we were looking for, and what we accomplish, often what we accomplish of significance is not what we set out to do. And I think that's a profound statement that I find whenever I'm looking at history, is that the major breakthroughs, the major changes in history, the major changes in this human story that we share isn't always the result of what we were looking to do. I mean, I would tell you that I don't think anyone in the founding of the Spanish colonies, even the French colonies in the Ohio Valley and Canada, the English colonies that will occur along the coast, no one was intending when those occurred to create a new nation state that would be something totally unique from what the world had ever seen. That just sort of happens. And it's one of those fascinating parts of history where now we have the luxury of looking back and going, aha, that's a step in that direction. Aha, there's a footprint. Aha, they were just making footprints. They were just trying to survive. Will Durant has this wonderful statement that he makes in his histories where he talks about that we too often think of civilization as that river that is flowing, and that the river tends to be fueled by blood from wars and powers and struggle. But the true story of civilization is occurring on the banks, and that's where people are falling in love, and they're marrying, and they're having children, and they're dying, and they are, planting crops, and they're harvesting, and they're learning new techniques, and that's where civilization is truly occurring. And that the river flows from when you have clashes that occur with visions or cultures or just pathways. I will tell you that Columbus's discoveries were the beginning of a great clash of cultures, all of which contributes to our story as United States citizens, Americans, however we refer to ourselves when we travel about in the world. The settlement of this nation by newcomers produced a profound unsettlement for those people who were here who were not newcomers. And we'll look at some of that as we talk about Colonial America. That the cartoon that you see ever so often is you see someone who appears to be native saying, well, great, we've been discovered, didn't know we were lost. It's one of those things in history of, who's writing the stories as to what's going on. We are at 423, which, puts us pretty much to the end of our time. When we come back next week, what we're going to look at, what were the people who were those first colonists, whether you look at St. Augustine, which is really the first city, not a permanent colony, whether you begin to look at Roanoke, and then we talk about Jamestown, what were the influences in Europe that made those who chose to come choose to come? What were they looking for? What were they hoping? We say so sort of, I say so glibly, new beginnings, new hopes, lands of opportunity. But what is it that they were hoping for? What were they dreaming for? And how does that manifest itself as we begin to found colonies? If you look at the record of Roanoke and look at what those early settlers, some of whom go back to England, some of whom disappear, what they were looking for, it's very different from what the original colonists in Jamestown said, even versus what those under John Smith's leadership 2 years later would say to what those in Rhode Island. And it's a fascinating story that I think all of us are familiar with, but sometimes we need that reminder that there were a multitude of reasons for why people chose to come here, why they were willing to take the risk, because the dream was so large. What I always hope is that we as citizens of this nation, as active and engaged citizens, realize how big the dreams still are and how important it is, though, to be actively engaged, to keep that vision alive, and then to do what we can to expand it, to teach others about it, because the moment, and I think it's true with anything in life, the moment that we take for granted the things that we have in our lives or the things that we enjoy are the moments when they begin to slip through our fingers because we don't recognize their value. So we're at 4:25. I'm going to hush and just tell you what I would love to see you in the chat box. Maybe I'd love to know how many of you, if having been given that opportunity to have been one of those early settlers, and I mean, it's hard to imagine the pressures, the tensions, the family dynamics. I mean, how many of you, if we were establishing a new colony on the moon, would want to be among that first wave of immigrants? Would you be willing? Would the idea of adventure, a new horizon you'd never seen, new expressions, would that be enough for you to be willing to take the risk associated with walking away from what you have? I always find that to be an intriguing question. No, Marianne says, nope, she's not going. No way. This part of my brain thinks it would be so much fun to see the moon, to see where Neil Armstrong planted that American flag. And then for me, and it's because of my age, but what if that meant I never saw my children again or my grandchildren, or I didn't know what happened to the next generations? That's a tough one. You know? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you can put in the chat box, since I'm still not really hearing everybody. Christina, you're probably hearing everyone. So, thumbs up. How many of you? Garnet's headed to Mars with Elon Musk. Yes, Garnet. I want to rock. And Arlene says, what I think is going to be true for a lot of our early settlers, if my life was really, really difficult where I am and I didn't feel like I had a lot to lose, maybe so. Then maybe breaking those family ties is enough to take the chance. And I think you're going to find, that unless you were the second son of a wealthy family and you didn't get any of the money, but you at least had a family name, most of those of us who trace our ancestries back, I'm not so sure that my Irish, Scottish, German, Dutch, Swiss immigrant ancestors were leaving a very easy life when they chose to come here. That's what's interesting. I love seeing your face. I have done something with my screen, so now that I can see some of the faces that I have missed so much over the last few months. I just can't wait until next time where we can actually talk to each other a little bit better. Christine, they're all you. I'm assuming you're in charge. Are you in control, or is it Suzette or?
Well, I don't know. Oh, you can't hear me, can you? Let's see. Oh, here we go. In case you cannot hear me.
I can't hear you, but I'm going to turn it back to you and go read a history book. Check one out from the library. Get an audio book. Go do your genealogy. If you're interested in DAR, talk to me. I love digging up dead people. They don't argue with you. Living family members can be cantankerous. Dead people are fine.
And you can always come into the library and talk to Suzette because she's a genealogy genius.
You all have such an absolutely fabulous collection up there in local history and genealogy. I mean, you can just kind of wallow around in all of that. So, I mean, we have so much fun planned for this fall, just kind of taking a step by step. We'll get ourselves founded next week, and then it all just turns loose. And it is an exciting ride, footsteps, or hanging on to the horn of that saddle if you're riding hell bent for leather, whichever way. I hope you all have a lovely, lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
It's always nice to know who you are, where you're from, and where you're going. And I have missed you all so much. I feel like my family's reunited. Things are going to get better, and we can meet one day, maybe actually in person outside downtown at the library or something. Meet on the steps and have a class. I would love that. Thank you all.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. And